Welcome to Beat Diabetes. If you've been watching this channel for very long, you know that I'm all about glucose spikes and taming those spikes. And I wanted to start today out with a quote from the MD Anderson website. It says, "In the short time, a spike in your blood sugar will cause a sugar rush, followed by a sugar crash, with all the cravings and lethargy that go along with that. In the long term, repeated spikes in your blood sugar can cause heart problems, kidney problems, problems with eyesight, and nerve issues like neuropathy, where you lose feeling in fingers and toes." Doesn't sound too good. Now, keep in mind, they're not talking about just constantly elevated glucose. They're talking about spikes where you just jump up too high and then you go down, and then you have another meal and you jump up too high and you go down again. And the thing that led me out of diabetes and out of the miseries connected with these spikes was focusing on the foods that didn't produce the spikes. And how would I know that? Did I just try to go up on a mountain and meditate until lightning would strike my brain and I'd figure out certain foods don't produce spikes? No, I used a little device called a glucose meter. And I would test myself after eating, about an hour after eating usually. And I found some foods spiked me tremendously and others hardly at all. So, reducing spikes has been my way out of diabetic misery. And it has been the way for many, many people that have followed this channel and have learned a few things. Now, I was having diabetic complications well before I ever had a diabetic A1C, if indeed I did. I went for years without even getting an A1C. I was kind of scared to do so. And I was determined to beat this thing by diet. And so I didn't even go to the doctor. Now, initially I did, but I was having a normal A1C, or probably close to normal anyway, but I was having all kinds of issues. The point is, it was the spikes that were causing the issues. It wasn't constantly elevated blood sugar. So I had things like UTIs. I had terrible arthritis. My fingers still reveal the effects of that arthritis. I had such terrible arthritis, I could hardly shake hands with people that had a firm handshake. I liked those wimpy handshakes because it was too painful for my arthritic fingers. I had frozen shoulders, terrible pain in a shoulder, and you can hardly raise it. And just various things, irritable bowel syndrome. The people that stress a plant-based, high-carb, low-fat approach, they don't want to hear about spikes. They don't like anybody talking about glucose spikes because they instinctively know that if they're eating high-carb, they're getting glucose spikes, but shove that out of your mind. They don't want to hear about it. And so if someone does push them very hard on this subject, what about glucose spikes? Aren't those bad for you? They will come up with a stock reply. It's in their talking points. Spikes are normal. Spikes are natural. Don't be afraid of spikes. As long as you can come down within a couple of hours, all is well. That's their idea. Well, naturally, that's what their idea would be, because they all get them. If you eat high carb, you better believe, unless you are extremely unusual, you're going to have high glucose spikes, especially as you start to age. So rather than admit they have them, they'll just say, don't talk to me about them. Glucose spikes are normal. They're natural. In fact, there was one major YouTube diabetes guy. He's a type 1, and he showed a graph of his own glucose rise and fall after eating a relatively high-carb meal. And he didn't put out the numbers, but you could calculate by the spike and by the graph that he showed. He was basically showing a 100-point milligrams per deciliter spike. According to him, that was just normal, natural, healthy, and good. All was well. The point is, he got back down in a couple of hours to where he was supposed to be. Well, I would say that's not natural, that's not normal, and most importantly, that's not healthy. When you're having 100-point glucose spikes at most of your meals, or every one of your meals, or even some of your meals, it's not a good thing. And one major problem is that when your glucose is spiking, guess what? Your insulin is following hard on its heels. The insulin will go right up with your spike. You're going to have not only glucose spikes, you're going to have insulin surges. And the problem with the insulin surges is they'll take their time coming back down. Your glucose may be back down in a couple of hours. Your insulin, it may take 3 or 4 hours for it to kind of settle down. So your body's being flooded with insulin constantly if you're eating high-carb meals. And that's not healthy. It's not good for you. And so a big problem. But let's get to the idea that they like to defend themselves with, those that eat high-carb meals and claim it's natural, claim it's healthy, claim we're all supposed to have spikes. The reality is this: gentle glucose rises are natural. It's not like they sometimes accuse us of wanting a totally flat line in our glucose. Well, I don't know anybody that says that. I certainly don't. I'm not looking for a flat line response to glucose. I mean, once in a while, that's great. And if I had a meal of a couple of sticks of butter, that's probably what I'd get. But I don't eat sticks of butter for my meals. I have butter with certain things, but I don't eat sticks of it like that. There's nothing wrong with glucose rises. There's something very much wrong with glucose spikes. So, for example, if you're start out at 95 milligrams per deciliter and you have a fairly low-carb meal and you rise up to 125 and then you work your way down back to in the 90s, you've done very fine. I don't get nervous or shook up just because my glucose rises. I don't like it to spike. I don't want it to spike. And I just don't ever plan for it to spike because I eat the kind of meals that don't make it spike. I figured that out a long time ago. I mean, we're talking back around 2002. I had a glucose meter and I was testing, and I began to divide foods into categories. Spike my blood sugar, don't spike my blood sugar. I would test, okay, you move over to this category, you move over to that category. All right, with that having been said, let me just talk about Dr. Richard Bernstein. I know I've talked about him before, but I want to talk about him in terms of seeking normality in terms of blood sugar spikes and blood glucose in general. Dr. Bernstein became a diabetic back in the 1940s. He's now 89 years old. He's type 1 diabetic, and he spent about 20 years in the wilderness, and he didn't know what was going on. He was having severe glucose spikes. You talk about spikes. He was getting as low as 40 milligrams per deciliter and spiking up as high as 400 milligrams per deciliter. And he was doing this almost daily. Huge swings of glucose, huge fluctuations. But he didn't know it for the longest time until finally he ordered a glucose testing machine. Now, they didn't have the little small things we have today. This was like a 3-pound big metal device, but it would give him a number for his current glucose. And he started testing himself like crazy. And he found out, wow, I can be as low as 40, I can be as high as 400, all within a few hours' time. And this was happening every day. And he had all kinds of diabetic complications. He was going blind. He had kidney failure. He had all kinds of issues. He was a mess. But when he began to see what was going on with his glucose and those terrible spikes, he began to make some progress. He looked for articles. He was reading voraciously, trying to figure out what's going on. What can I do? That was his big question. What can I do? So he had heard that exercise is good for diabetics, so he looked for articles about exercise and how they can normalize blood sugar. He began to get the idea, if I could just have normal blood sugar, all would be well. And he says, I couldn't find a single article about normalizing blood sugar through exercise. But then he read an article about animals and how researchers had been able to normalize their blood sugar, not by exercise, but through low-carb diets. And he found out that, yeah, you actually can get normal blood sugar with animals. He went to his own doctor. He wasn't a doctor yet in those days. And he said, well, I'm reading how that they can normalize blood sugar in animals, even after their blood sugar has gone way out of control and they're terribly diabetic, and they can bring it back to normal. All his endocrinologist could say is, well, yeah, but you're not a rat. You're not an animal. It's not going to work for humans. Dr. Bernstein writes, it had not occurred to me that keeping blood sugar levels as close to normal as possible for as much of the time as possible would make a difference. So suddenly the light bulb is going on over his head and he is saying, wow, maybe I can normalize my blood sugar. Hadn't thought about that, but maybe I can. And he began testing, doing the same thing I did. Testing his blood sugar, eating a meal, testing his blood sugar. He says, if a change brought an improvement, I would retain it. If it made the blood sugar worse, I'd discard it. Well, that just makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, that's what you would do. I mean, normally speaking, if you weren't poisoned and biased by your own ideology that says animal products are horrible and that says you've just got to eat high-carb diet and that'll somehow fix it, don't ask me how. If you weren't poisoned by that kind of an ideology, that's what you would conclude. He talks about how that eventually, he says, I taught myself how to make my blood sugar levels whatever I wanted them to be. And I was no longer on the roller coaster. Things were under my control. Man, you talk about euphoria. I found out I could make my blood sugar whatever I wanted to be. No more down to 40, up to 400, down to 40, up to 400. Now things are normal. And he was so thrilled. And he mentions how that after this, he continued to read articles about blood sugar. He says, every few months, I read another article saying that blood sugar normalization wasn't even remotely possible. And he asked the question, how was it that I, an engineer, had figured out how to do what was impossible for medical professionals? They're all saying, hey, you can't normalize your blood sugar. And I found out I could. For mine. He even tells at one point, I don't forget if it was in this book or maybe I just heard him, but I heard him mention that he was in a conference for medical professionals and they were talking about diabetes, and one of them said, well, we all understand that once you become diabetic, you can never have normal blood sugar again. We all get that, right? And everybody smiled and nodded. Yeah, we all get that. He says, anybody disagree? And Dr. Bernstein kind of raises his hand up. Yeah, he disagreed, and they got into a little bit of a discussion at that conference. And he ended up saying, well, yeah, but I've done that for mine. I've normalized my blood sugar. Well, that's Dr. Bernstein. Let's talk about you for a little bit. Let's talk about you. Let's say you just found out you're diabetic. You're a mess. You've got neuropathy pains. Your vision is lousy. Your doctor says your kidneys are failing. You've got all kinds of issues. You've got arthritis, maybe. Your problems could be over fairly quickly if you, not Dr. Bernstein, not Dennis Pollock, but you, if you could figure out a way to have relatively normal blood sugar and blood sugar spikes specifically. If you could just do that, and chances are when you were in your early 20s, that's what you had. You had normal blood sugar. Normal blood sugar is in the 80s, 80 milligrams per deciliter. And typically, no matter what you eat for a meal, it's hardly going to go past about 130 milligrams per deciliter. Maybe once in a while, a little past it, but not much. So between 85 as a norm to up to maybe 130, 135 after a meal, and then it'll bounce back down in about an hour and you'll be back in the 80s again. That's normal. That's how you were, chances are. Although these days young people are not nearly normal, but that's how normal people that are on the slim side, metabolically healthy and eating reasonably good meals, that's what they do. They're in the 80s. They may bounce up to about 130 after a meal, bounce back down within an hour, back in the 80s, go to bed, wake up in the 80s. That's normal. Now, I'm not saying you have to exactly be normal, but if you could get anywhere close to normal, and that's one of the reasons we talk about the fives club, because when you get into the fives, maybe that's not perfectly normal. Dr. Bernstein would probably, in fact, he would say that's not normal, but that's getting close, especially when you're 5.5 or lower. You're getting mighty close to normal. Now, you may say, yeah, but I can't turn back the clock. Maybe that's how I was when I was 21 years old, but I'm not 21. I'm 55, 65. I'm 75. I'm not of the age that I can be normal anymore. Wrong. You can be normal, but you have to make some adjustments. It's kind of like most people when they were young didn't have to wear glasses. Most people, by the time they're my age, they wear glasses. Now, oftentimes, your glasses will help you to see almost as good as you did when you were young. But if you try to take them off, you don't see so well. So you wear glasses. You take a couple of extra steps to bring yourself to normal so that when you get in your car and drive down the highway, you're not a danger to yourself or anybody else because you're seeing close to normal. Maybe not perfectly normal, but pretty close. Now, what if that could be the case with blood sugar? What if you could get your blood sugar close to normal? And the answer is for most of us, you can. Most type 2 diabetics. Dr. Bernstein, type 1. And he runs an A1C in the 4s. I'd say that's mighty close to normal. In fact, pretty much dead normal. Now, not everybody's going to achieve that kind of success. And by the way, he's almost 90. I think he's 89 right now. But type 1 or type 2, you can get mighty close to normal, but you're going to have to make some adaptations. You're going to have to make some adjustments. So what do you do to make the adjustment? Well, we've discovered that when you cut the carbohydrates and the sugars and the grains and the starchy foods like potatoes and rice, blood sugar starts to drop. Now, typically what you do is you work on the spikes. You may have a glucose of 300 milligrams per deciliter, average throughout the day. You're saying, man, I'm not anywhere close to normal. I can't be. I can eat a low-carb meal and I'll still be 300. Yeah, but if you'll work on the spikes, the blood sugar will follow and it will start to lower. So your number one goal is not to say, well, I'm going to go from 300 down to 95 by tomorrow. No, that'll never happen. That cannot happen. But the goal is this next meal, whatever my next meal is, breakfast, lunch, or supper, this next meal, I don't want a big spike. That's possible. You may have glucose at 300, but you can still eat such a meal that it's not going to go too much over 300. So let's say you have a meal of a hamburger patty, no bun, no ketchup, hamburger patty, maybe some cheese on it, some salt, and a garden salad with a low-carb dressing. And you find that you were 300 before the meal, and after the meal, you're just 322. Now, 322 is outrageously high, yes, but the spike is the good news in the thing. You didn't go up much. You say, wow, that actually worked. I had a low-carb meal, and my blood sugar, although it's terrible, it didn't go up very much, and that's an improvement for me. And so let's say that was your dinner. Now it's breakfast time. If you're eating 3 meals, I'd encourage you to eat 2. But if you're eating 3, breakfast time. I'm going to have something reasonable. I'm going to have a couple of eggs and maybe a little bit of broccoli and maybe a couple of pieces of bacon. You woke up in the morning, you're still at 300. But once again, you eat that meal and it goes up to 322 again. You say, well, that's a pretty good rise of glucose. Your goal is not flatline. Your goal is not, I don't want it to rise even 1 point. That's dumb. There's no problem with glucose rising, but there's a big problem with it spiking. If you, let's say your glucose is at 300, and you eat a big high-carb meal with lots of bread and macaroni and cheese, and you have a big old dessert, and you drink a big old soda, and it jumps from 300 to 425, that's a problem, my friend. That's a major problem. So you work on the spikes and you just say, all right, for today, no spikes. I don't mind it rising. It can go up a little bit, but no major spikes. We're not going to have a 100-point stretch of a spike today. Breakfast, lunch, dinner. And if you keep doing that, and finally the day's over and you had no major spikes, guess what? You will not be able to stay at 300 milligrams per deciliter. You won't be able to stay there. It will start to work its way down gradually. And I won't even say slowly because sometimes it can happen mighty fast, but definitely it'll start to make its way down. And the battle is won one meal at a time. Forget about next year. Forget about next month. Forget about next week. What about today? What about my lunch meal today? My dinner meal today? Can I avoid a major spike? You won't know if you've had one or not unless you test. So that's why I encourage people to test. Figure out, just like I did, just like Dr. Bernstein did, figure out what makes your glucose spike. What foods do that? And avoid them. And down it comes, down it comes. You watch the spikes, the glucose comes down. And for those of you that say, Dennis, you're focusing too much on glucose, you don't talk enough about insulin. If you can bring your glucose down by diet and by what you eat, your insulin will sheepishly come following down as well. No glucose spikes, very little insulin surges. So you get lower glucose, lower insulin, and after a while, those diabetic complications recede and usually go away altogether, those that haven't been permanently spoiled, and life is good. So don't let anyone tell you that glucose spikes are meaningless or suggest that no matter how high you spike, well, that's just normal. Glucose gentle rises are normal. Glucose monster spikes are a nightmare, and they are totally abnormal, unnatural, and unhealthy. If this video has been a blessing to you, there's a very simple way to show your appreciation. How about giving it a like and maybe sharing it with somebody else? YouTube will notice this and they'll promote it to others.